All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for Mackinac Center New Issues and Idea. Are unions good for workers? When we planned this, we did not think, well, we might be in the last week of the state budget, whether that's going to get decided or not. Normally that's decided a couple months beforehand. So it's an exciting time here in Lansing as they're trying to figure out all those issues. But we are grateful for everyone that could make it today and for those that are streaming online. So our I&I today is, are unions good for workers? Labor unions are often promoted as a powerful tool for protecting workers, raising wages, improving job conditions. But do they deliver on those promises? And do they deliver on them as well today as they might have used to do? So we're going to have a compelling discussion on the real-world impact of labor unions and collective bargaining agreements in Michigan, nationally, and around the world. So we're going to dive into some recent research that perhaps challenges the conventional wisdom about organized labor, looking at the data on effects on jobs, wages, other trade-offs in worker contracts, and then also just the long-term impacts of collective bargaining agreements on the rest of the state and society. And then we're going to get into the Q&A, kind of what constitutes a true pro-worker environment. What laws should policymakers and business leaders and employees actually care about in the state? So I'm really excited to be joined today by two experts on this. Ravana Sharfuddin, she is a pre-doctoral researcher in the Labor Policy Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in Virginia. Her research centers on labor economics, the evolving nature of work, and the ways that labor markets can adapt to foster growth and mobility for workers with diverse backgrounds and needs. She has appeared in a whole variety of media outlets all the way across the country. She has her bachelor's in economics from George Mason. She has a master's in development economics from the Friedrich Alexander, I'm not going to say the rest, a university in Germany. Chris Douglas is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan Flint. He earned his degree in electrical engineering and a degree in economics from Michigan Tech. And he got his PhD in economics from Michigan State University. So he's covered a couple of the university systems here in the state. So wherever your allegiance is, Chris has a degree from that school. His research interests include applied macroeconomics, energy economics, public finance, sports economics, and he has published studies in these areas in many academic journals. So we're going to do presentations from Chris and Ravana, and then we'll do some moderated questions from me. And if you think of questions as we go here, go ahead and write them down, and I'll read them out to our panelists, and then I'm sure they'll be happy to hang around afterwards if you have a few questions. So first, we're going to hear from Chris Douglas.
Do you want to advance the slides? Do you want me to? Oh, okay. So thanks for the introduction, Jared. It's always great to be at the Mackinac Center. Which side? Oh, well, maybe I'll just be in the middle. I could be in the middle. Oh, that works too. Musical chairs here. So higher wages are the primary selling point for why workers should unionize, though there are others such as better fringe benefits, a bigger voice in company operations through things like a grievance procedure, better workplace safety. Those are all purported benefits of unionization. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus my opening remarks here on wages. So the AFL-CIO purports that the so-called union wage premium is $191 a week. It's linked right here if you get a copy of my presentation after this event. This means a unionized worker earns about 15% more per week than a non-unionized worker does. And the AFL-CIO says it's due to the union. But as I will talk about in my presentation, this number is flawed. I do tackle the other purported benefits of unionization in my 2011 research study I published with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy entitled Advantages and Disadvantages of Unionization. You can find it linked here, or you can find it on the Mackinac Center's website. But just real quickly, workplace fatalities have steadily fallen since World War II. Fortunately, they're incredibly rare now, so there's not a whole lot of benefit to unionize for a more safe workplace. A grievance procedure provides very little benefit for a worker. Most workers would not trade a pay increase for one. And for whatever reason, we could speculate on these reasons. There's evidence that workers who utilize the grievance procedure end up worse off afterwards, even if they win the grievance. So I just want to talk a little bit about some economic theory about how unions extract wage gains. For a union to extract wage gains, the employer, the firm, has to be a monopolist. We know what that means, or an oligopolist, which means you might have 2, 3, 4 firms producing a particular product. I'm going to call all those monopolies, meaning the market's not competitive. When the market's not competitive, that generates what's called monopoly profits for the firm. Profits over and above what a firm would earn in a competitive market. The union can then bargain over what they view as their share of those monopoly profits. If there's a cost increase as a consequence of a collective bargaining agreement, that could be passed on to consumers via higher prices because the consumer in this market has no options, very limited options. The point is, we have what's called bilateral monopoly. The employer is a monopolist over the product being produced. The union is a monopolist over the labor being used in the production process. So you have like two monopolists bargaining with each other. If you think about a competitive market, that means you have lots of firms selling a particular good. Fast food is a very competitive market. You got lots of people out there selling hamburgers. In a competitive market, there's very limited, if any, monopoly profits to be bargained over. And since the market is so competitive, the employer, the firm, can't pass on a cost increase to consumers from a collective bargaining agreement because the consumers have options. Think about what would happen if McDonald's unionized. McDonald's would be very limited in the wage concessions it could give its new union because the individual McDonald's restaurant is not super profitable given how competitive the market is. And the individual McDonald's restaurant would be very hard pressed to raise the price of a hamburger because consumers go buy a hamburger from someone else. An example of a market that is not competitive, Jared said I researched sports economics, so I'm going to give a sports example. Think about the NBA. The NBA is a monopolist for basketball entertainment. If you're a basketball fan, you have to watch with the NBA, which that generates significant monopoly profits for the NBA that the players' union could then bargain over. Any cost increase from a CBA could be passed on to the basketball fan through higher prices because where else is the fan going to go? So this is Michigan, so I wanted to talk about the auto industry. Go back to 1961. The Detroit auto companies, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, they were the equivalent of the NBA back in the 1960s. They controlled 85% of the auto market. That generated significant monopoly profits for those firms that the UAW could bargain over. Any cost increase from a collective bargaining agreement, and there were many, were just passed on to the consumer via higher prices because in the 1960s, you want to buy a car, who else are you going to buy from? Fast forward to 2024, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, they're the equivalent of McDonald's now. They only control 38% of the auto market. They face stiff competition from the other non-unionized automakers who control the other 2/3 of the auto market. There's fewer profits for the UAW to bargain over, and the Detroit automakers can't pass out a cost increase very easily to consumers via higher prices because the car buying consumer now has options. So unions and their supporters will publish research that purports to show big wage gains as a consequence of unionization. This research is flawed for two reasons. First, this research doesn't control for anything else that determines a worker's wage. It just looks at the average wage of a union worker, the average wage of a non-union worker, sees that the average wage of a union worker is higher and says, due to a union. Well, there's a lot more going on than that. You would have to control for, meaning account for. The union research is like saying, well, West Bloomfield has higher household income than Oscoda, Michigan, which is my hometown. So everyone in Oscoda should move to West Bloomfield because they'll get rich if they do so. Well, obviously, there's a lot more going on than that would have to be controlled for. So that's the first big problem with union research. Second big problem with union research is this research doesn't tell you anything about what happens when workers vote to unionize. The implication from the AFL-CIO and others is that if you unionize, you get a 15% pay bump. Not necessarily. It's just an average. That average could be driven by legacy union companies like General Motors that still pay higher wages than everyone else as a consequence of that legacy. It doesn't mean that, well, if Toyota's workers vote to unionize, their pay will be immediately jump by 15%. So I've done a couple of pieces of research for the Mackinac Center linked right here, tried to correct the first problem with union research. Back in 2014, I published this study, Problems with Estimating the Union Wage Premium, where I just looked at the union wage premium broken down by industry. I didn't control really for anything else. I just wanted to see what's the average union wage, average non-union wage in particular industries. And what I found was for all industries but one, the union wage premium has steadily shrank since 1985. There's only one industry where it's actually grown, and that's in education and healthcare, because that's an industry characterized by very strong government-created barriers to entry that keep non-union competition out. And then this past year, I published a study about right to work with the Mackinac Center. It's on their website. It's linked here. This was in response to a 2015 Economic Policy Institute study, where they purported to show that right to work states have lower wages on average than non-right to work states. But their study really didn't control for anything like I talked about. So what I did is I took their methodology, implemented some really straightforward controls, and found that, well, not only do right to work states not have lower wages than non-right to work states, but right to work states actually have slightly higher wages than non-right to work states. So me personally, I have not done any research addressing the second problem with union research, but I found a very interesting study published in 2021 in the Journal of Labor Economics by a Brigham Young University economist who, coincidentally, I assume, his first name is Brigham. And this study should be more famous than what it is, even though it's published in the top field journal for labor economics. Because what he does is he tries to answer the question, what happens when workers vote to unionize? What happens to their wage and other things? And what he does is just massively impressive effort. He looks at something like 45,000 union elections involving about 23 million employers, and he's able to match that up to about 2.8 billion observations of household earnings. What's he find? Well, what he finds is post-unionization, there's a reduction in employment at the firm as a consequence of older, more experienced, which means more productive and thus highly paid workers leaving. Because what a collective bargaining agreement does is it compresses the pay schedule. So if you're an older worker, highly paid, union's not super appealing to you. So those workers tended to leave, which arguably makes the firm less productive, which might be why the study found that a firm is more likely to go to business following a successful union election. It's a pretty big effect, in my view at least. Something like 10 years post-unionization, there's about a 10% greater chance the firm goes out of business. I would certainly be worried if there was a 10% chance my employer was going to go out of business. But what about the workers who stay? Do they see that 15% pay bump? Do they see a big pay bump post-unionization? Actually, they don't. What this study finds is that workers who unionize see a very minimal impact on their wages post-unionization. The author of the study, he calls his results surprising. I suppose they're surprising because they run against what the unions claim. I don't think the results are surprising at all. I think they're right aligned with what we'd expect given economic theory. So some concluding thoughts for my opening remarks here. Given the competitive reality that unions face, that employers face, how competitive the modern economy is, the ability for unions to deliver big wage gains is very limited. The 2019 and 2023 General Motors strikes, or the UAW strikes against General Motors, are a complete waste of time, money, and energy. As I talk about in 2 columns I published in 2019 on CNN.com about the 2019 strike, I published those with help from the Mackinac Center. The final offer the UAW got to settle those strikes was not noticeably different than the final offer they got right before the strike. The strikes were just a waste of everyone's resources. For unions to deliver big wage gains, the economy would have to be organized into cartels, which would generate monopoly profits that unions could bargain over. An example of that would be, if you go back to the Great Depression, FDR, he implemented what was called the National Industrial Recovery Act that would organize each industry into cartels. The prices would be set by the federal government at above market rates that would generate monopoly profits for the firms that the unions could then bargain over. I don't think it was an accident that the Wagner Act came right after the National Industrial Recovery Act. Fortunately, the National Industrial Recovery Act was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but the vision of the economy that it envisioned was kind of like the de facto situation for industries like the auto industry in the 1950s and the 1960s, which was when the unions got their big gains. So there's like a knee-jerk reaction by some on the populist left and the populist right that we should go back to that era. because that would allow workers to get big wage gains, right? However, that would be absolutely horrible for consumers because less competition, which is what that would mean, means less consumer choice, higher prices, and lower quality. It would be horrible for the US economy in general. So that's what I've got. I look forward to the discussion, the questions to follow. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rivana Sharfuddin. I do labor economics and policy research at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. I want to challenge a widely held assumption that the more powerful unions automatically mean better outcome for workers. With public support for unions at 57-year high of 70% and recent high-profile strikes for unions securing seemingly massive wins for workers at companies like Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and UPS, you might think this case is closed. But our analysis of 147 studies published in top 5 economics journal spanning 3 decades reveals a more complex and concerning picture. The central question we tackle is this: do these apparent big wins at the bargaining table Is it better now? Yeah, I think so. Thanks for that. The central question we tackle is this: do these apparent big wins at the bargaining table actually translate into long-term outcomes for workers? Our research reveals a critical distinction that's often overlooked in labor policy research: the difference between unions' voice phase and monopoly phase. The voice phase represents unions' valuable role in providing workers with collective representation. That's true. Sometimes better communication with management and a platform for addressing workplace concerns. The function can sometimes genuinely benefit workers and firm alike, but the monopoly phase tells a very different story. That refers to exclusive legal authority granted to a single certified union to represent all workers, even non-union members, in a bargaining unit. This legal monopoly blocks other unions, alternative forms of representation, and individual negotiation. Here's what our comprehensive literature review found. When the monopoly phase dominates and unions secure seemingly high big wins through aggressive collective bargaining, companies respond predictably. They trim R&D, cut capital investment, reduce growth, and ultimately shrink jobs for unionized workers. This isn't because unions are inherently problematic. It's because the US labor law create monopolistic structure that amplify confrontational tactics and block more cooperative types of alternative. Let me share key findings from our analysis. Of all the variables we studied, employment showed the most consistently negative effects from powerful unionization. Study after study shows when the unions extract unsustainable terms, companies respond with slower employment growth and fewer job opportunities. Perhaps our most compelling evidence comes from a recent study of the Rust Belt's decline. Between 1950 and 2000, the region's share of US manufacturing employment fell from 51% to 33%. Powerful labor union and frequent strike, with major work stoppages occurring roughly once every 5 years, accounted for 55% of this decline. Initially, Rust Belt manufacturing workers earned substantially higher wages than similar workers elsewhere, but over time, a labor conflict drove up costs and reduced productivity. Firms relocated to regions with lower labor costs and less workforce conflict. Our research shows unions consistently reduce R&D investment and tangible capital investment. Companies face excessive union demands, cut back on very investment needed for long-term competitiveness and job creation. While our early research suggested union might boost productivity through better worker management, communication, recent studies show the opposite. When unions set wages above the market rates, disconnected from productivity gains, both tangible and intangible investment suffer, ultimately hindering firm productivity. The news isn't all bad. When we look internationally, we see the union structure matters enormously. Jared before mentioned my study in Germany that influenced some of this research. German unions operate within decentralized systems that allow multiple smaller unions to compete and negotiate flexibly at regional level. This creates wage flexibility that aligns well with local productivity while maintaining worker voice. Portugal demonstrates how collective bargaining can coexist with individual wage flexibility. Firms can deviate from set wages based on individual worker productivity, education, and experience, offsetting the rigidities typically imposed by collective bargaining. British labor laws allow multiple unions to represent workers in the same workplace, preventing the monopolistic characteristic we see in the US system. These examples show the worker voice and collective bargaining can thrive without the monopolistic distortion we see harm American workers. Our findings point to key policy reforms that could preserve the benefits of unions while eliminating the monopolistic downsides. The Reform 1, expand worker choice. Currently, the National Labor Relation Act forces all workers in unionized workplace to be represented by a single majority-supported union, even those who don't want to be represented or don't want the representation. We propose allowing employees who opt out of union membership to negotiate directly with employers, just like workers in non-union industries do. This solves multiple problems. It gives workers genuine choice, relieves union from having to spend resources representing non-members, and addresses free rider concerns that union raise about right-to-work laws. Reform 2, apply antitrust principles. Labor unions often operate like monopolies, eliminating competition, controlling labor supply, and tactics that would be illegal in product markets. We should consider applying corporate merger guidelines in unions, such as preventing single unions from representing competing companies' workers, limiting any union's market share in an industry, requiring antitrust review of multi-employer bargaining arrangements. Recent evidence validate our analysis. UPS announced a network reconfiguration that could result in closing 10% of buildings and workforce reduction right after their contract negotiation with Teamsters. Stellantis laid off 1,100 employees in Ohio just 1 year after the UAW's 46-day strike. Boeing announced layoffs affecting 10% of its workforce just 1 month after a 7-week strike that cost the company $9.7 billion. These aren't isolated incidents. They're predictable consequences of a system that amplifies union monopoly power while blocking more collaborative alternatives. More union power doesn't automatically mean better worker outcomes. It's the structure of representation, not the presence of collective voice, that determines whether union help or harm workers. Worker deserves genuine representation and voice in workplace. But they also deserve a system that promotes long-term job creation, innovation, and economic growth. Policy reform that break up union monopolies while preserving worker voice can deliver both. The choice isn't between powerful unions or no unions. It's between monopolistic unions that may win short-term battles while losing long-term war, and competitive, flexible unions that can sustain both worker gains and business growth. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. You both kind of touched on that percentage of workers in unions has declined over the decades, particularly here in the United States, not sure about internationally. What is your explanation for that decline?
So I think there are a few things going on. When you look at the traditional heavily unionized industries, or what I should say is the traditionally heavily unionized companies within industries, like the General Motors, the Fords, or the Chryslers of the world, we can look at the steel industry and similar industries as well. What you have seen is a steady decline in market share of those companies and a rise in market share of non-unionized companies, like you saw on my slide of auto company market share. So that goes a long way in explaining it. Also productivity in manufacturing, and that a lot of manufacturing is automated. So even the unionized companies need fewer workers than before to produce stuff, because so much of like making a car is done by robots rather than people. kind of the general shift of the US economy towards a service-based economy as a consequence of productivity gains in manufacturing. And like I talked about in my presentation, the service economy is extremely competitive. Even if a particular company in the service-based economy unionized, the companies could be very hard pressed to offer wage gains. So I think it's just kind of a mix of factors of the US economy that's driven a decline in unionization.
I think I agree with pretty much everything you had to say. I would just add one more thing is that I think over the years, US economy just grew so much more competitive and workers actually became elevated. They came to more elevated levels of jobs where they actually can bargain for themselves and they can ask for better wages for themselves. As Jared was sharing before, I was living in Germany and I lived here and I worked as research assistants in both countries. And in Germany, I had a collective bargaining agreement and it was kind of lower than what I was making when I was living in DC and working as an RA. So in my mind, why would I want that collective bargaining? I can bargain for myself. So I think the competitive nature of the US economy is something that to consider here.
A lot of the people talking about that union wage premium or in the policy world where there's a lot of emphasis on trying to benefit unions. So in these debates over right to work laws, but on things like prevailing wage, where we got to mandate union wages on construction projects, which shifts the balance towards unions getting those firms. One of the theories or what's proposed is that union workers are more efficient. So yes, they cost more, but they make up for it because they're just better at doing the job. Now, I don't know if the UAW believes this or not, because when they were building a private summer home for their previous president, they did get in trouble for using non-union labor. They picked a non-union bid on that. So I don't know if they really believe it or not. But what about that theory that unions make these workers more productive so the higher cost is worth it?
Yeah, that's just like saying the higher minimum wage is worth it, because when you raise the minimum wage, that makes workers more productive. We have a free market economy. So if union labor is really more productive despite the higher costs, people will voluntarily seek that out. You wouldn't have to force them through prevailing wage law. Likewise, if raising the minimum wage makes workers more productive, you wouldn't have to mandate an increase in the minimum wage. Every employer wants a more productive workforce, so they would just naturally raise wages to make those workers more productive. So the fact that employers aren't raising wages, it has to be mandated through the minimum wage, since employers are maybe actively seeking out union workers for construction projects. It has to be mandated through things like prevailing wage. I think that calls into question that argument that union labor is more productive.
It's actually quite an interesting point, because if you have a very highly competitive worker in union, he should probably earn more than the rest of his team. But if he is getting the same contract as his teammates, it's actually compressing the wages. So it's kind of funny to mention that they're all productive at the same level and should get all the same wages.
Great segue to my next question, which is, what about workers within individual industries and bargaining agreements? So clearly, some workers are going to benefit from some parts of the collective bargaining agreement. But if you're treating everybody within that agreement the same, what are examples of people that benefit and people that don't benefit within an individual union contract?
So there's a couple of examples of people who benefit. Traditionally, union contracts reward seniority. So if you're a more senior worker, you tend to get more of the benefits. You're the last to be laid off. If there's any sort of like cut to pensions, cut to healthcare, sometimes that doesn't impact the senior workers. It might impact the more junior workers. We saw that with like the 2-tier wage schedule that was implemented when the auto industry got itself into real trouble back in the 2000s, right before bankruptcy. So senior workers tend to benefit. Also, if the collective bargaining agreement compresses the pay schedule, that could benefit maybe the more junior workers if it bids wages above market wages. But that comes at the expense of, well, that it becomes harder for people looking for a job to find a job. So really the people who benefit are like the insiders. The people who are harmed are maybe the outsiders looking for a job, or like I talked about my presentation, if you're like a super productive worker at a firm, you've been seeing big pay increases because you're really productive. Well, your pay increases are going to be limited by the collective bargaining agreement, and now the union's not super appealing to you, and like that study showed, those workers tended to leave for alternative employment.
I would like to mention a study that just came to my mind. I love that question because, I mean, in our study, we analyzed 147 studies. I wanted to mention the one study that you mentioned about voting and election, and I think it's a RDD estimate, right at the margin. It's beautiful. If you're an economist, it's a beautiful estimation technique. It really clearly.
Oh, sounds great because I didn't understand any of that, but yeah.
I could immediately recognize the paper because in our compilation of 147 paper, that was one that was my favorite. I would like to mention another paper that kind of highlights a new thing. I felt like I learned a new thing, which is when you have a collective bargaining agreement that's kind of protecting the senior workers because you have tenure-based wage and not productivity-based wage. When you have, for example, a business cycle shock and the whole industry goes away, these workers need to now find a new job. So the unionized workers, they are actually less competitive. They were not learning the skills at the job because they didn't worry that their jobs are going to be lost. So when there is a business cycle event, the non-unionized workers, during the whole time, they learned a new skill, all of this, so they could easily get a new job, even if their sector completely diminished. But the senior workers whose jobs were really protected, they were not learning the new skills when there is a business cycle event. We follow the workers like 5 years after, and they have the hardest time to find a new job. So in a way, the senior workers, they think in the short term, I'm protected, but we cannot foresee business cycle events, recession, COVID. So when the entire industry diminishes, you're not competitive and you struggle to find a new place. That's one of the studies that I really liked. I'm forgetting the co-author's name. I would have loved to give them a shout out. But the second point I would like to make is that younger worker joblessness. We see in the United States that young men are really suffering to find a job. And it's not even younger men's unemployment rate, it's younger men's joblessness. They're not even looking for jobs. And why do they suffer? Because you need to have an economy where mobility is available. If some folks are in a job where they don't have to be productive, they don't have to learn the new skills, they can just keep their jobs, there's not enough opening for the new ones to come in. So a big problems we see is younger men's job mobility and joblessness. That I'm looking at just economic outcome, which is bad, but it also has some social and political negative effects that we are seeing in our country right now.
A lot of your talks were focused really much on private sector and private sector unions. We've seen this particular decline in the number of private sector union members. How does this all affect the public sector, where you have government unions that have made up more and more higher percentage of the overall union membership?
Yeah, public sector unions are less affected by market forces, of course, because the government by definition faces no competition. So I think with public sector unions, what it does is it kind of maybe bids up the cost of government. And public resources are scarce just like any other resource. So if the cost of government services is bid up due to a union, that just leaves less resources available for the other things that the government can do. I think a problem is, and this is maybe why public sector unions were first illegal until I think it was maybe President Kennedy who legalized public sector unions. But there's kind of like the symbiotic relationship between the elected official and the public sector union, where the elected official trades off political support for big gains at the bargaining table. And those big gains could often be like things like very generous pensions. We see that in California, we see that in Illinois, not so much in Michigan, because even though the teachers are still out of public pension, state employees have been off the public pension since I think 1996. But it's really easy to give a union a big pension because the bill doesn't come due for another 30 or so years, whereas the political support comes in right away. Well, states like Illinois are now trying to figure out, well, how do we handle this? Because the public pension system is so unaffordable. But thanks to the strength of the public sector unions in Illinois, as a consequence of that trade-off of political support, public sector unions are protected by the state constitution. So at some point, something's got to give, and I really don't know what that something is.
I would like to make a bit of a theoretical economics point and a then more practical point. The theoretical economics point being some of the public sector jobs are really essential. For example, firefighters. Sometimes I do think some workers probably need some kind of bargaining power if your jobs are very highly substitutable. meaning somebody can just replace you next day, maybe you don't have so much voice. But the public sector unions, such as the firefighters, they are so essential. They already have a lot of power. They don't have to collect their power together to bargain for something. In economics, we call it inelastic inelastic wages, meaning their wages are not affected by external problems. For example, if we have COVID, if we have recession, the firefighters don't really lose their jobs. We make sure they stay around. So I think from economic point of view, it's kind of almost perverse to have public sector unions because their jobs are essential and they're kind of monopolizing on top of that. And the second point I would like to make is public sector teachers union. It's really hard for economists to study this because in most places we can't see, okay, if union did not exist, what would have been the scenario? What would have been the scenario? But in Wisconsin, there was a ballot measure where they changed for teachers union that the bonuses and this promotions are not going to be based on just tenure, it's going to be based on productivity. So after that ballot measure was in effect, we saw that teachers' productivity went up. And not only that, people from other states went into Wisconsin, teachers were better, went into Wisconsin and became teachers there. And we saw a huge area of really positive student level outcome. And some folks told me that it's reversed. I have to look into it again. But I think that study shows that how important it is for especially essential jobs like public sector teachers union, how much we need those competitive forces in play there for the students' outcomes.
It's commonly said by labor unions that labor unions created the middle class, or labor unions helped end child labor, created the weekend, these types of things. What's your response to that? Is there truth to that? Is it overstated? Is it totally false? What's your opinions?
There might be something to that, but I think what's more responsible for everything you mentioned is just long-term economic growth, because long-term economic growth means people are getting richer. And what you see when people get richer is that they start demanding more leisure time. I want my weekends off. I want to work 8 hours rather than 12 hours. I don't want my kids going down to the salt mines. So I tend to think that.
Well, you haven't met my kids.
Oh, well. I'm a runner. I was just looking at a 5K in Kansas that takes place entirely underground at a salt mine. So that'd be kind of fun. But at any rate, I tend to think it's just like the steady improvements of standard of living that has driven those things, because we still see living standards increasing despite the fact that unionization has steadily shrank since the end of World War II.
I love that question. It's very interesting because I think economists are almost triggered by this. Correlation is not causation. The same time we saw improvement in living standard, the same time American economy just boomed. And the trade-off between leisure and work started to look bigger. We started to demand more leisure here. It's I find myself in a privileged place that I have lived in 3 different countries. Maybe my name or my accent. I'm from Bangladesh. I grew up in Bangladesh and I did my undergrad in the US and then I studied in Germany. That helps me so much as a social science researcher to see these contrasts and this historic trend. And in Bangladesh, you have very limited labor laws. You don't have these protections that we do here. But my father, who works hard and has a college degree and everything, he had 2 days weekend. And then folks who are working in ready-made garments industry, you can look at your shirt and you will see made in Bangladesh. They don't have those 2 days. So it really matters your competitive level and where your economy is. So if I had an arc of economic development, a curve I could make here, Bangladesh is probably here, United States is probably here. So even the folks who have similar wage in Bangladesh, like United States, just via market mechanisms, they are able to bargain for 2-day weekend, just like my father.
I was going to guess your accent was from the Upper Peninsula here in Michigan, but thanks for clearing that. So we got some questions from the audience that we've got to get through here. First question I really, really love. So there's been an increase in outsourcing of manufacturing. Is this increase in manufacturing outsourcing to other countries, Mexico, Canada, how much of that is a result of union demands versus other circumstances?
Maybe there's some, but I tend to think most of the outsourcing that we see are due to like very labor-intensive production processes. Like the clothing industry just takes a lot of workers to put a piece of clothing together. And a worker like Vietnam or Bangladesh is always going to be cheaper than a worker in America, regardless of whether the worker in America is unionized or not. So I think it's more along the lines of, what techniques go into the production process that drive manufacturing outsourcing. But it's a real myth to say that everything in the United States has been outsourced in terms of manufacturing, because the United States still produces a ton of manufacturing output. It's something like about $2.3 trillion worth every single year, larger than the entire economies of lots of countries out there. It's just that thanks to productivity advantages, you don't need as many workers working in the factory now as you did, say, in the 1950s. So it's the productivity advantages in manufacturing that's really driven the decline in manufacturing employment, not so much outsourcing and unions, although those might play a role on the margins.
I would like to kind of bring the conversation back to one study I cited. That study was done in the Rust Belt, and the union strike could directly point at the reduction of the employment level from 51% to 33% in the Rust Belt area. And most of those farms actually did move to Mexico and some other countries where they could kind of avoid this kind of rigid contracts. On the other side of this is that we have harder time tracking these workers, is that if you are losing the manufacturing jobs, where are you going? Because we see from all of the statistical evidence that the jobs continue to grow in the United States, and they're higher elevated levels of jobs. The wages are higher. Even people who are in Bangladesh don't want to work in the garment. They come here and get the service jobs, like working as an economist. So that we see the elevated job levels in the United States. That's kind of the one piece of it. And the other piece of it is to see when people are working, how are they working? And I think we need to kind of reimagine the American middle wage job. I don't like to say middle class because the data is all fuzzy there, but there is a job polarization that happened here. We had diminishing the middle sector of the job a little bit in those years. But I think there is a reimagination that's necessary, that's modernized workforce, because we have kind of the AI revolution happening here. What does the future of job look like when you have these AI tools? It's people working alongside these machines. And I want to imagine an elevated status of a manufacturing worker when he's working alongside maybe some VR goggles and he's in his farm and he's analyzing what's happening in real time. So I think it's time to not kind of be sad about those jobs, rather think about future of our jobs and manufacturing world in the United States, elevated status of job, empowering manufacturing jobs with what's happening in the United States and not happening in many other countries like Europe, which is the AI revolution. So how do we empower this workforce with the new technologies rather than be sad about it, about the past?
Yeah, I really love that, Ravana. And I come from a family where my dad's side, they worked in a variety of working class unionized industries: electrician, cement, construction, auto. And that 2007-08 recession was very, very scary. And I'm sure for a lot of people in the room remember that. It was a very scary time for my family and people that are working in those private industries when everything feels like it's collapsing and you've done a job for 25 years and that's all you've known. But there was also a response to that. And I saw it with my own family. I think we saw it where people did transition their skills or come out of it. And for some of my family, they left a unionized industry and went to a non-union, and it worked out as well or better. So that point on productivity and adjusting, it's very scary in the short term, but it can work out longer term for the economy. I'm going to combine these two questions because they're kind of on the same point. The first is, in my experience working in a unionized manufacturing facility, collective bargaining disincentivizes productive workers. They see unproductive workers receiving the same pay and benefits they're receiving, so they naturally ask themselves, why am I working so hard? But another person, the question on the end of that is, does asymmetric information give some workers a disadvantage negotiating wages? So if one worker negotiates well, but another does not, is the second one kind of getting, where they don't have that same skill set in negotiation, even if they're both equally productive, is it kind of harming them?
I would like to take the first question because I would love to talk to you from the audience after, because I think sometimes as social science researcher, we need to learn more. Because we are in our room looking at the papers and not really talking to the worker who is in the farm. And there is so much learning to be done. but I'm trying to relate to that, the experience that I have, which is when I was in Germany and working as an RA, and I was part of a union. You can imagine that George, if you are familiar with George Mason type economics, is that we are very strong free market oriented folks there. And my George Mason soul was very sad because I just started this new research assistant job, and the first email I get is, "You're part of a union." And I went, ooh, that wasn't a nice feelings, because I had dignity that I could speak for myself. But I realized that I had this very rigid wage structure, and it's a little bit of cliche, which is also true, that European work culture is very different. I saw my peers log off at 4, go outside and drink Aperol spritz.
It's more about culture than the work part of that, I think.
Yes, but I loved doing economics research, and I would like to stay in and publish and, you know, go to conferences, talk to people. So I stayed in and I worked more, and my peers would literally make fun of me. "Why are you doing that? We're literally making the same." That was very frustrating. So as soon as I could, I came back to America. But so that's kind of goes into the first comment of the frustration that you are working harder, you have bigger goals, bigger aspirations, but you are not compensated for it. So this is anti-productive, anti-innovation way of looking at an economy. And I would maybe let you take a stab at the second question.
Yeah, I think the second question is saying if you have two workers, they're doing the exact same job, one worker is a better negotiator than the other, then the first worker gets a higher pay than the second. There might be something to that, although workers talk. So the two workers all like talk to each other with beers after work or at a coffee break or something, and the subject of pay will come up. So I tend to think that workers doing the exact same job, at least initially, get paid the same wages. I think employers are like very gun shy about things like discrimination lawsuits where, you know, two workers come in at the same time, one makes more than the other due to like better negotiating or whatever. Where you might see differences are like due to longer term productivity differences, that after both workers have been on the job for a period of time, you know, one worker might be more productive than another, which might drive a pay difference. And the more productive worker has other options, because every employer wants a productive worker. So often what drives the pay increase is when a worker goes to their boss and says, "I've got this opportunity at another company. Can you match it or not?" And often the boss will say, "Yeah, I'll match it because I don't want to lose you." So I think that's probably what drives pay differences, is productivity differences once the worker's already on the job. But initially, I think companies are just very hesitant to offer different starting salaries to very similar workers.
I would like to add a little bit to that. I think some of the market frictions we face, like asymmetric information, gets reduced when we have better technology, which is called Glassdoor, where we can go in and check wages of the similar level. And we see in literature that if you are in the margin of society, if you are a minority, oftentimes you ask for lower salary. That happens. But I think technology helps a lot. We can go check now anonymously. We can post our own salary. So I think any of these market frictions, it's easier to kind of handle those over time with better technology.
Why must industries be monopolized for unions to realize the gains and the costs to be passed on consumers? Couldn't unions unionize all firms in a competitive market?
Yeah, that's just another way of saying monopolize a competitive market, because then you don't have competition anymore.
Ditto.
You mentioned AI, artificial intelligence. So what will be the effect of artificial intelligence on unions or union membership?
Oof, that's such a tough question. I like to say that as social scientists, we should have humbleness, and AI is a new thing and we're all learning about it. The early results are not as scary as what we see from kind of technologists. I try to stay on top of, okay, what's the most recent and most rigorous, top quality research out there. And we recently have a publication that we can study from ChatGPT data from all over the world. And so far it's been productivity enhancing, people are learning new things and not completely replacing job. I'll give an example. This morning, anytime I go on an event and I have to speak, I'm very frustrated how long as a woman it takes for me to do my hair. This was very frustrating. But in an AI world, I was talking to my AI and preparing for it.
Chris was nodding along over there, by the way, just so.
So what happens here? This is actually, let's say there is a wage gap between men and women because we need to spend more time on hair. what's ChatGPT doing that's reducing that wage gap because I can be productive and doing my hair. So I think early results is making all of us productive and making all of us more educated about different topics. And I can imagine that in manufacturing jobs also. And I think there is a chance that we can revive the manufacturing sector by elevating the status of the job. It doesn't have to be those jobs when it's like backbreaking and you're doing all this very hard labor. It could be like, oh, you are with this cool technology and you're good. Because I think a lot of the manufacturing job families, or even I talked to some constituents who were in a farm heavy state, and there was this tendency that we have to leave farm work because we have to go into those tech jobs that are higher status and all of that. But what if agriculture and tech comes together and agriculture has those cool high status new world job kind of signaling? So I am optimistic, and that's my AI future for manufacturing or agricultural jobs. And the data so far, the best quality data we have, they're not scary.
I don't have anything to add now.
All right. We had a couple more, but we'll have to have you come up and talk to our presenters today afterwards. So please join me in thanking our panel. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward, if you have not, I hope you do go to mackinac.org, sign up under events so that you can get alerts for any of our events that we have. We have them many in Lansing, but also all over the state on a variety of topics. We stream them online. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you at the next one.